Let me also say to you, you guys are pretty intense to have this many policy sessions before lunch. You are the few, the bold. I'm glad that you hung around. I'm grateful. I want to also thank John Cowan and all the Third Way team, who I think have put together a great couple of days of sessions here. Two other folks I want to acknowledge. I think Chris Coons may have stepped out, but we saw a lot of my fellow members of the House. But there are also, one of the things looking over the group of folks who are here, a whole lot of folks who are coming from office of mayors and state representatives and county executives and others, and enormous good work. And a lot of those belong to the group called the New Deal Democrats that I'm proud to be affiliated with. And so there is a lot happening around, obviously around the country. Let me say, even though I am the last speaker before lunch, it is great to be here in Columbus. After this week, it was great to be anywhere outside of the Beltway. Just to give you a quick snapshot of how my week started, I'd planned months and months ago with the Atlantic Council to bring in a series of parliamentarians from a lot of our European nations, allies who'd all been subjects of Russian intervention in their election system. So we're all gathering at the Atlantic Council on Monday morning, and there were Estonians, and there were Latvians, and there were Ukrainians, and Czechs, and Poles, and Brits, and Canadians, and Swedes, and it was like their heads were spinning as we put off the beginning of our session, as we saw basically the President of the United States kowtow to a Russian leader, and to deny the validity of what happened, not only in our country, but happened in their country and continues to happen. And I think if we knew before this week that the stakes were high for our country, we now know that our stakes are extraordinarily high for the whole world. So as Democrats, I think the first admonition needs to be, we better not screw this up. We better not screw this up. Yeah, we need to realize that this is one of these fundamental transition points in our country, and for that matter, in the world. And there's been a lot of, I'm going to talk a little bit about framing, and I think what that democratic agenda ought to look like. But I think even when we step back from even the opportunity agenda, we need to try to force Americans and the press and others to realize that the issues we're confronting at this moment in time really don't neatly fall into traditional red versus blue, or even left versus right. And we've got to block our way out of that framing. The issues we face fundamentally, from national security to the economy, are all much more framed, I think at least, in the aspects of the future versus the past. And the truth is, the Democratic Party has always been at its best when we've been the party of the future. And I think in many ways we've been reluctant to embrace that recently. We all have heard, in many of the presentations who've gone before me, I won't go through all the stats, but folks know that automation, technology, globalization, they're all coming. And I think people in their core get the notion that as wild as the last 20 years have been, it pales in comparison to what the next 20 years will bring in people's lives and how they work and where they work. Elvis Payne and I are working on some of these issues. And they're really worried not only for themselves, but they're worried for their kids. And are they going to have that fair shot? And I think, begrudgingly at least, we have to acknowledge that Donald Trump in 2016 understood the emotional impact of these changes better than, frankly, we did. Now, his solution set has not been something that we would advocate for. Let's face it, for those folks who've had their jobs outsourced or eliminated by technology, he's basically blamed bad trade deals and picked fights with everybody from Justin Trudeau to Harley Davidson. For folks who didn't get a raise, he blamed immigrants. For communities that have gone decades, literally, of economic decline, he put together a tax plan that frankly offered a lot of promises and not much delivery. The truth is, the president, I don't know if he's not engaged or not interested, but the idea of really addressing some of these underlying concerns, there's been no effort at all. And as a matter of fact, what he's been mostly trying to do, with whether it's tweetage or other things, it's to distract the American people. And what is so extraordinary, and what I think has got these great women to run and is getting the kind of support that they're seeing all around, they know that the distractions that Donald Trump has put out, oftentimes with, in a sense, dog whistles around racial and religious exploitation, really is not who we are as Americans. And obviously, we as Democrats, one of our first things we have to do is fight against the noxious identity politics, that kind of low-end scapegoating that Donald Trump represents. But the truth as well is, and I think this is what's been so good about what Third Way has done with the Opportunity Conference, is Democrats have to be more than the party that says no to Donald Trump. You know, there's not a day that somebody doesn't come up to me and say, oh, Senator, thank you so much for all you're doing, and how close are we getting to the end, and do you have, what do you have, what's Mueller going to have? We all know that if in normal times, with this kind of corruption, that the agencies and elsewhere, with this kind of incompetence of the president performing or lack of performance on the world stage, or with just the kind of sheer volume of outrageous tweetage coming out of the White House, in normal times, that would in itself be enough to clean house and guarantee us victory. But I got to give you guys a newsflash. These are not normal times. These are not normal times. And frankly, as Democrats, we have to not only offer something different than Trump, but we have to offer something better than Donald Trump. And I think that's what this conference has been about. And the truth is as well, and has been reinforced by these candidates, I heard some of the candidates say that their district has not been competitive in 40 years. We've got to show that Democrats can win not just in traditional urban, suburban districts, not just in places that are doing well, but all over the country. And for those of Virginians in the audience, excuse me for a 2-minute divergence and say, I can tell you, we can do it anywhere. Back when I ran for governor in 2001 in Virginia, Virginia hadn't voted for a Democrat for president since 1964. All 5 of our statewide elected officials were Republican. Our legislature was 2-to-1 Republican. We ran on an agenda that did basically 2 things. We said, we're going to go places where Democrats hadn't gone in a long time, in rural communities, where the jobs were textiles and tobacco and furniture and coal. And not say we got all the answers, but at least be willing to try to talk about the future for those communities and what the future for their kids might look like. We also said we ought to take advantage and not forget the core base of our Democratic Party, people of color and immigrants and those core communities that oftentimes Democrats take for granted. And we also, as some of the candidates earlier mentioned, there was also at that moment great dissatisfaction amongst Republicans. So the whole notion of a Republican Party, I had the advantage of coming after a pretty dreadful former governor, but there was an opening with Republicans that I think exist again in 2018. So this notion that it's an either or anywhere just isn't the case. And in Virginia, we showed that you could be named at the end of my term as governor the best managed state, the best state for business, but also at the same time be named the best state for a lifetime of educational opportunity from preschool through graduate school. They were not contradictory. And that framing has allowed Virginia Democrats to take 4 out of the last 5 gubernatorial races, almost take back the state house. Our recent governor-elect won by 9 points, and with great candidates like Abby, we are going to win back multiple districts this fall in Virginia. If you can do it in Virginia, you can do it in Ohio, you can do it in Indiana, you can do it in North Dakota and Missouri, anywhere across the country. So again, we have to be that party that's not afraid of this future. The challenges we face are enormous. But honestly, isn't that our DNA as Democrats? Haven't we always been at our best when we've been talking about the future? We were the party, from a historic context, that saved the American dream after the Great Depression. The Democrats were the party that actually said, we're going to stand on the right side of the struggle around civil rights or women's rights or LGBTQ rights, or for that matter, the new battle about whether we're going to continue to be a nation that welcomes diversity and immigrants. We've always been on the right side. That's who we are. We've also been the party that brought about a lot of the economic prosperity that has made some parts of our nation extraordinarily successful, but candidly presented a set of changes that really are quite staggering. So I know I'm echoing what has been said by other speakers, but I think this notion that our kind of frame ought to be, Democrats ought to be the party that advocates an opportunity for every American to earn a good life, is both core to who we have been historically, and also leans into both the challenges and opportunities that our nation faces at an economic level and on a worldwide basis. Now, I would argue that the fundamental underlying challenge we have, and I spent more time in business than I did in government. I've been blessed to have done very well in business. But I had to tell you, as somebody who believes in our system, modern American capitalism is not working for enough people right now. And we've got to think that through and grapple with it in ways that are broader than one idea or one policy. I would argue a lot of the insecurity and concern and the angst that Donald Trump so accurately tapped into arises from three factors. One, income inequality. Two, income insecurity. And three, the crisis of opportunity. Now, on income inequality, I think all Democrats have advocated. The boundaries and barriers and the divides have gotten extraordinarily bigger. And there's a lot of things government can do. But I think we have to realize economic inequality at this point is going to take more than a government program. It's going to have to recognize that our basic fundamentals of our system may have to be reexamined. We built the World War II economy in a time era where there was abundance of labor and shortage of capital. In 2018, not only in America, but in the world, there's an abundance of capital, but a shortage of qualified labor. We built a business cycle in the recent decades that I'm not sure would have created the post-World War II economy if it had existed in the 1940s. We built a business cycle in the current days that so favors short-term success over long-term value creation that great American companies could not have been created. And those companies on the tech side that have been created today are companies that aren't subject because the owners own a large share of the stock and aren't subject to short-term pressure. And in a way that I don't think we even fully appreciated, a lot of this economic inequality came about, I would argue, because for decades after World War II, when workers and managers and owners lived in the same community, you maybe didn't need a rule to keep people treating their workforce well. You just didn't want to show up at church and be viewed as a schmuck. But now we've seen that disaggregation where workers and owners live in very different communities. So income inequality, we're all in. But what we don't talk about as much, and I would argue if it was only income inequality, I'm not sure Americans would have elected a billionaire president. We have to think about economic insecurity. I would argue that one of the things that made America so distinctly different, kind of pre-World War II and on until the recent times, was our basic social compact. It was an agreement between business, government, and labor that said, if you got a job, chances are you'll be able to work at that job for most of your career. And while you may not get rich, and my family fell into this category, you could buy a house, you might be able to buy a car, you might be able to send your kid to college. I'm the first in my family to graduate in college. And if you worked for a long term, you got some health care, you got some retirement, and God forbid you lose a job, you're going to have programs where the state would step in. Unemployment, workman's comp, disability. That world is changing. A third of the American workforce today does not work in traditional long-term W-2 employment. So economic insecurity is rampant in our country. Third area, and this is where so much of the good work that Matt and Jim and John and the whole Third Way team has done, is around this notion of crisis of opportunity. You know, you can pick your statistic. I'll take the most conservative one, but if you look over the last 20 years, more than 80% of all net new jobs in America have been created by startups. They're not all tech. A lot of them are manufacturing. They may be in food services elsewhere. But 80% of all the net new jobs have been started by startups. It is a crisis of opportunity then when 3/4 of all venture capital simply goes to California, New York, and Massachusetts. In a country that's increasingly diverse, there was statistics out today that in terms of Fortune 500 CEOs, the percentage of women leaders has dropped. It is a crisis of confidence and a crisis of opportunity in our country when less than 1% of all venture capital goes to African Americans. And the percentages with Hispanics are a little better, Asians are higher, but if we don't see this spread around, if we can't, in an interconnected world, we promise that the wonders of technology was you can build it anywhere, but we have not proven in America that you can really have that opportunity anywhere, that you shouldn't have to leave your hometown to find a world-class job. And we're going to have to take on that issue as well. So as opportunity Democrats, what should our agenda be? Most of our conversation in the last 2 days has been on economic issues. And I want to spend the balance of my time on that. But there's one item I think we need as well. We need to understand that as opportunity Democrats, we have to articulate a 21st century national security strategy as well. And I'm worrying increasingly after the last year and a half on the Intel Committee whether we've got this right. We just passed a budget that had $713 billion for defense, highest ever. Russia has a budget of $67 billion in defense. China has a budget roughly of about $175 billion in defense. I believe in a strong American defense strategy, but I worry that we may be buying the world's best 20th century military with tanks and guns and ships and planes. When our adversaries have realized that most of 21st century conflict probably is not going to take place on a classical battlefield, but will be within the realm of cyber, within the realm of misinformation and disinformation. We've already seen Russia, with its 1/10 defense budget, manage to interfere in our elections and interfere in our intellectual capital in ways that frankly caught our whole security establishment off guard. We've seen China, that spends less than 1/5 of our security budget, take that excess dollars and actually invest it in artificial intelligence, in 5G technology, in quantum computing. So as opportunity Democrats, part of that opportunity needs to be a national security understanding that meets our adversaries, particularly our near-peer adversaries like Russia and China, in the domains of cyber and misinformation and disinformation. We also need, as so many folks before me have talked about, to get back to kitchen table issues. That notion of inequality, insecurity, and crisis of opportunity. We need to articulate better than we have, frankly, that this tax plan that Trump put out, a $2 trillion tax cut for the wealthiest and corporations with borrowed money, with a country that already has $20 trillion in debt. Well, there have been examples of these kind of policies in other countries over history. This is not a plan for success. We've got to actually articulate real tax reform. Tax reform that understands that we've got to go into the heart of our tax code. Something is wrong in America in 2018 when a company who buys a robot to replace a worker, that investment in a robot is a capital asset that you put on your balance sheet, and if you spent that exact same money on training up and skilling up that worker, that would be a cost and a liability. 21st century tax reform ought to change that. Trump didn't have a chance to do it. Opportunity Democrats should. We need to obviously continue to own the world of healthcare. We need to not only talk about coverage and cost, but we need to realize that the problems in healthcare with people like me and the baby boomers moving into retirement, we're moving from challenges around acute care to chronic care. And Democrats ought to be on the lead, not only in talking about affordable prescription drugs, but also about cures for Alzheimer's, and frankly being brave enough to engage, because Americans are way ahead of us on this, in having adult conversations about end-of-life issues. Truth is as well, we've not really had a plan for rural America in decades. And we ought to think about our investment in rural America not as simply a single government program, but we ought to make a statement and an investment and stick to it that says in every rural community in the 21st century, both broadband and next-gen 5G technology is not a nicety, but a necessity. That would be something that would rally people because they understand it may not be a guarantee to success, but if their kid's going to have any chance to stay in the community they were born into, they've got to have that connection. I think a topic that we don't, as Democrats, often talk about. But we ought to recognize it's time now, particularly with Trump, to articulate an agriculture policy. We need to be talking to farmers that say that Trump's trade wars are going to kill agricultural exports. And Trump's boneheaded anti-immigrant, anti-legal immigration program is going to allow crops to rot in the field. And Democratic candidates, not just from rural areas, but across the board, ought to be articulating those visions in 2018. Another subject that doesn't get much attention, and it's pretty nerdy, but we need to go ahead and reform our housing finance system. We ought to make sure that that pathway to the middle class that existed for particularly post-World War II of home ownership is made accessible again and actually go forward in a way that corrects the inherent discrimination that has existed against people of color and particularly first-time homebuyers. Truth is, there are enormous challenges in front of us. But at our core, we have to be the party also of hard work. We have to be straight with the American people and say to them, automation, technology, globalization, they're coming. The idea that you can finish your schooling even after college or postgraduate and be done with training for your lifetime is going away. The jobs are not all going to disappear, but literally, Ms. McKinsey has indicated, a third of the American jobs today will radically transform themselves by 2030. So 2 final ideas. We ought to acknowledge, when we talk about economic security, that not many people are going to go work for the same firm the way my dad did for 38 years. Most people before 40 will have 6 or 7 different careers. And the idea that you're going to have a single, stable income stream just isn't going to come to pass. Both by economic necessity and with certain millennials by choice, you're going to have a combined stream that you might be an IT consultant part-time, starting your own business another part-time, driving Uber on the side, and renting out your house Airbnb. We need to create a 21st century portable benefit system that moves benefits with workers as they move from job to job and income stream to income stream. And we need to recognize as well that that idea that you've got to have lifelong learning needs to be filled in. We have to be radical, not incremental, about job training. And the ideas that have been discussed here around community colleges and 21st century apprenticeships, let me leave you with one other. For the last 50 years, we directed a heck of a lot of capital based upon the R&D tax credit. Wouldn't it might be time, with this imbalance between capital investment and labor, that we actually create a human growth tax credit and say we will reward every company, no matter where you are, if you put a meaningful training program in place on an annual basis for everybody who, say, makes less than $90,000 a year? But really recognize we need that partnership to make sure that Americans are going to participate in this economy. And finally, as again, Third Way has done such a good job on, we have to make not only a government-wide program, but a society-wide program that makes sure that the opportunities that we support as Opportunity Democrats are not isolated in communities like Columbus or Northern Virginia or Boston or San Francisco, but that truth that says you can build it anywhere in an interconnected world and that you shouldn't have to leave your hometown to find a world-class job becomes more than a slogan, but becomes a reality. Now, these, I think, are big ideas. We're not going to beat Trump with incrementalism. We're not going to beat Trump with simply saying he's bad. What the American people are looking for, and these candidates that we've seen her earlier today reflect, is they get it that we're at one of those historic moments. It's a time to be bold. It's a time to seize on what has been our legacy as a party that's willing to address the American people straight-eyed in terms of the issues of the future. We are Opportunity Democrats. We do believe that everybody ought to have that opportunity to earn a good life. We take those policies forward. Not only will we beat Trump, but more importantly, we will maintain the legacy of our Democratic Party, and most importantly, make sure that that notion that the American dream is still alive for every American is a reality. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for enduring through the whole thing.